one of the things too about Ansel, people have this picture of him as being, a techno fanatic about photography and, the zone system. You've got to have this perfect and have that perfect. Nothing could be further from the truth. He did love science and technology. There's no doubt about that. But Ansel started out as a musician. And for Ansel, testing film and doing all of this stuff was absolutely nothing different from playing scales.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 371 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week on the podcast, I had the wonderful opportunity to speak with Alan Ross. Alan is most well known for being one of Ansel Adams' assistants and for being the only person to exclusively print Ansel's Yosemite Special Edition prints each year for the past 50 years. Any history buffs will greatly appreciate this week's episode as we take a deep dive into Ansel's life through Alan's lens while exploring Alan's own vision and thoughts relating to photography and how photography can act as a means of communication. If you appreciate these sorts of conversations, your support of the podcast is greatly needed. I operate on the value for value principle here on the show, which simply means I personally believe that if you find something of value, even if you can get it for free, you should show your support in some way financially. As such, I desperately need more listeners to step up and contribute on Patreon if we're going to sustain this model. Over the past 14 months, I've invested thousands of my own dollars in making improvements for the show, including investments in video production, help with show note writing, and much, much more. If you can help out, please do take a moment and visit patreon.com/fstop and listen, or find a link in today's show notes. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks to everyone who's already supporting the show. You rock. All right, let's get to this week's episode with Alan Ross. All right, Alan Ross, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Great to be here.
Yeah, fantastic. I don't know if you remember this or not, but we were actually co-instructors at Out of Yosemite way back in 2020, right before the peak of the pandemic, which was like...
Exactly, right? Just before everything hit the fan. Yep.
Yeah, that was a lifetime ago, it feels like.
It feels like it too. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I have very fond memories of that particular conference, and it made a very strong impact on me, and just getting to meet all of the amazing photographers from the Yosemite Valley area, including yourself, and learning about, the history of Ansel Adams and having his family there. That was just such a incredible experience.
Well, that's good. I really enjoyed it as well, and it was kind of nice to be in Yosemite that time of year. Mostly in the last bunch of years, I've been there in the spring and fall, but not in the winter, so it was great.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Alan, for the 7 people in Afghanistan who aren't familiar with you and your amazing photography, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I guess, as you mentioned, I might be best known as having my association with Ansel Adams for a number of years and printing his Yosemite Special Edition prints, which I'm working on almost 50 years of printing Ansel's negatives. So that's been a big part of my life, as well as my friendship and so on with Ansel. But photography's been essentially my life, my entire life. I made my first professional photograph when I was 19 years old, and it hasn't stopped since. So one thing has led to another. It's been a curious road, and not one that I certainly didn't plan, but it's worked out in a wonderful way.
Yeah, I'm guessing you've seen quite a lot of shifts in the industry in that long tenure in photography.
Oh, I have seen a lot, and being so in close association with Ansel, I had the pleasure of meeting all kinds of wonderful names in the field and so on. It's really been a great ride.
Yeah.
So
Well, as you mentioned, I think you're best known for your association with Ansel. My understanding is that he kind of handpicked you to help print his work way back in like 1975.
it goes back a little earlier than that, just as kind of a summary. I hadn't planned to be a photographer, although I developed my first roll of film when I was 12 years old. A new kid got on the school bus one morning with a 35 millimeter contact sheet. And I thought, wow, that's really neat. Where'd you get that? And he said, oh, I made it this morning. My dad's a photographer. Well, I dug out an old Rolleicord of my father's, and I developed my first roll of film within a week. And
Oh,
that's just been one step after another. But I always enjoyed tinkering with things, but I really enjoyed photography. And when I got into high school, in eighth grade, I was did photographs for our eighth grade yearbook and things like that. So I mean, I was already printing some things and so on. But got into high school, and I had friends that were into the Sierra Club and photography, and we got together, and I got myself an actual real 35 millimeter Nikkormat, and started having some fun with that. But I never really thought I was going to wind up being a photographer. I've always liked tinkering with things. And so I started college as a mechanical engineering student. But I'd taken photography courses and still really loved that. But at UC Davis, the only photography was in the art department, where they had me mounting prints on purple mat board and things like that, which seemed very strange to me. But this was in the mid 60s, 66ish, and so on. And I dropped out of the mechanical engineering. It was just too rigid a program for me. I wanted something more a little liberal, but things, environmental studies didn't exist at the time, and I was getting into the Sierra Club and so on. Well, I started the forestry department at UC Berkeley, but that turned out to be the lumber business, where they described a forest in terms of board feet.
right.
And that didn't sit too well. But it happened that UC Berkeley had a design department that was kind of patterned after a Nouveau Bauhaus. It had architectural and city and regional planning. It had glass blowing. It had, graphic design and so on, and silversmithing and photography. And so I started taking a photography course that could be repeated for credit. And I changed my major again into the design department. And one of my first instructors there was a retired New York fashion photographer named Ruben Samberg. And one time he asked our class, to name a photographer. And somebody said Ansel Adams, and he nodded, ah, yes, a cloud photographer. And then somebody mentioned Richard Avedon, and he said, ah, yeah, Little Dicky, we used to call him. And so that was my introduction. But then the design department got a new department chairman in the name of William Garnett, who had 3 Guggenheim grants for his aerial photography. And Bill became my first mentor. I repeated classes with him a number of times. And he introduced me to our class to a photographer in San Francisco that had been a guy named Milton Halberstat, who had been Maholi Naj's darkroom assistant at the School of Design in Chicago. And he had one of the top advertising studios in San Francisco. And so I saw my first 8x10 transparency in one of these classes. And one thing led to another. And I'd been taking photography now for a couple of years, and actually established an independent major in the department. It wasn't offered as such, but I liked photography enough to get hooked on it. And as a course, William Garnett kind of took me under his wing, and there was a plan for a bunch of elementary school science textbooks that were going to be published by Rand McNally. And they were interested in having a student make the photographs for this book. So I got elected to that, and that was my first professional job. And I wound up, while I was still at Berkeley, I wound up having to, I was told that my 35 millimeter photographs, as good as they were for the studio photographs, just weren't going to cut it. So I had to get into a large format and bought a 4x5 camera and started developing film and sheet film and trays and so on. It was really, really something. And one thing led to another. I finished my course at Berkeley, my courses at Berkeley. I have finished this job for Rand McNally almost at the same time. And I had nothing in my future. I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen. And I was driving my way home from UC Berkeley into where I was living in Sausalito, California. And I decided to stop by the camera store in San Francisco for some reason. I didn't need anything, but I stopped by the camera store and I walked in the door and I overheard a clerk telling some young fellow that there was a photographer named Halberstat looking for a studio assistant. Well, I'd been to the studio with Garnett a couple of times and I stopped in my tracks, drove down to the studio, and we talked for a while. He said, come back and show me some photographs on Monday. I did. We chatted for a while. He said, okay, I'm going out. The studio, the floor needs mopping. The scenar needs putting away. I'll see you later. So I wound up becoming his studio assistant. So one thing, once again, led to another out of just clear blue sky. And it turns out that Halberstat and Ansel Adams had been longtime friends. And I decided to invite myself up to Ansel's Yosemite workshop in 1972 while I was still working in the studio, loading 8x10 film holders with Ektachrome and pushing lights around and so on. And I got up to Yosemite and Ansel said, oh, you work for Hal? Wonderful. Help you stay as long as you want. Nice to meet you. So Ansel was just warm and greeting right from the beginning. At any rate, I stayed for several days, and Brett Weston was up there and some other people. It was a very interesting thing. And went home and decided, boy, I really, this is great. But then a year or so later, Halberstat decided to retire and close his studio. So I'd met Ansel before, and I just wrote him, said, do you need an assistant? And he said, well, no, I don't. I've got a fine assistant in the name of Ted Orland, but I would love to help out with the workshop. I assisted Ansel's Yosemite workshop in June of 1973 when the workshops were 2 weeks long.
Wow.
And it was amazing. And so I was a studio assistant, a workshop assistant then. And it was fabulous. And just right then, the Ansel Adams Gallery was establishing a rather bold and diverse set of photo workshops, not all with Ansel. They had a nude in the landscape workshop and with other photographers and so on. So I started assisting some of the other workshops there. And in 1974, Ansel asked me to be the assistant for his Making of a Photographic book workshop in July of 74. And when I got there, Ansel had got a new business manager in the name of Bill Turnage. And I was pulled aside saying that Ansel was interested in whether I might be interested in moving to Carmel and working for him full time. Ansel had no concept of a day off, and he had Ted working for him Monday through Friday. And I was to be hired to work Friday through Monday. So Ansel had an assistant 7 days a week. Well, it took me about a microsecond to think about to agree and decide to move to Carmel. And so in August 74, I was a resident of Carmel working for Ansel Adams. And that's how it all came to be. As far as the special edition prints were concerned, those were traditionally the realm of made by Ansel's assistants. I think, originally he probably went into the darkroom and set up the enlarger and dodging and burning, and then turned it over to an assistant to make the rest of the prints. But and Ted Orland had been printing making these prints. He'd been working for Ansel since 72. And at any rate, in early 1975, Ted went out on his own, and I was left being Ansel's assistant. And so the special edition printing fell to me in June of 75. And here we are going into March of 24. So I've been at it for quite a while. So that's how I got from nowhere to being where I am now.
That's fantastic. It's amazing how just a couple of connections can lead to a lifetime's worth of work and connectivity and productivity. And it sounds like you were in the right place at the right time. I'm sure you brought a lot of great ingredients to the table. and you
Yep.
had to act upon the opportunity that was given to you. But there is an element of like just being in the right place at the right time sometimes.
Absolutely, it's knowing the right person, and I had no plans on meeting William Garnett. I had no plans on meeting Milton Halberstadt. I had no plans. I never imagined meeting Ansel Adams, and just one thing just fell into another situation. So that was pretty wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. So one of my favorite books is the Mary Street Islanders biography on Ansel Adams. I just found it to be incredibly fascinating, just learning about kind of Ansel and his kind of his quirks and just the really, you see his photography, but you don't always hear about his personality and things like that. So I really like that book because it really allowed you to get to know him as a person.
Yeah.
From your perspective, having worked with him for many years, what was he like as a person, as a friend, and as a mentor?
Oh, Ansel was one of the warmest, gentlest, funniest people that I have ever met. He never let his notoriety go to his head, which is one of the most wonderful things about Ansel. He was a real people person. Um, he always, kept himself listed in the phone book. Anybody could, look him up and call him from anywhere, and that happened all the time. Somebody'd come to Carmel and say, here's Ansel in the phone book, and he'd call, and if he was anywhere near the phone, he'd answer it. And Mr. Adams, I'm in Carmel, and I just got one of your books, and I'm wondering if you could sign it. Oh, sure, come on out to the house after, at the end of the day, and so on. Or I'd like to show you some photographs. Oh, sure, come on out to the house at the end of the day. And he was incredibly open. He never let his notoriety go to his head. It was just a pleasure to be around him. He loved nothing more than a corny joke, and telling it for the seventh time, he'd laugh just as hard at the joke, on the seventh time as he did on the first time, And Edwin Land at Polaroid would call him up and tell Ansel a new joke, and Ansel and Land were very close friends, and it was a really, really amazing thing. Ansel was just a joy to be around all the time.
It's interesting because you describe him as a real people person, which is very counterintuitive for a lot of nature and landscape photographers. I find a lot of us are more introverted, not that don't necessarily go out of our way to spend a lot of time with other human beings. And he kind of broke the mold in terms of that particular model of nature photography.
Oh, he absolutely did. I mean, the end of the day, he'd, ask for his wife, Virginia. Virginia, is anybody coming over for dinner tonight? No, Ansel. Oh, he put his kind of head down. Well, can we call the neighbors and have them come over? I mean, he just loved having people around and telling jokes, and it was great.
And what was he like for you as a mentor?
Oh, he was fabulous. And one of the things too about Ansel, people have this picture of him as being, a techno fanatic about photography. And, the zone system, you've got to have this perfect and have that perfect. Nothing could be further from the truth. He did love science and technology. There's no doubt about that. But Ansel started out as a musician. And for Ansel, testing film and doing all of this stuff was absolutely nothing different from playing scales. He didn't want to hit a wrong note, and particularly, I mean, he was a very hardworking professional photographer for most of his life, making photographs for other people for pay, doing all kinds of things. And when somebody's waving a nice check in front of your nose to go make some photographs, you don't want to mess up. And Ansel was very comfortable with the science of math and so on, considering he washed out of grade school when he was a young guy, and he was mostly tutored in his education. He could read and write Greek. He would lose people when he started talking about logarithms and this, that, and the other thing in math. And that's one thing that didn't scare me because of my background starting off as in mechanical engineering. I had calculus and physics and chemistry and all of this stuff. And so none of that fazed me. The idea of using a densitometer to measure film was Okay, that's fine. It's saving time. But Ansel's, the whole point of it was to not hit a wrong note. He wanted to go out and be able to get what he wanted to get. And there was no perfection, in his mind. As a matter of fact, one of his favorite lines was, "The perfect is the enemy of the good."
That's one of my favorite lines, actually.
Yeah. And so, I mean, this was this incredible guy that I started working for. And, I think one of the other questions that you'd mentioned, earlier and stuff was how, working with Ansel had affected me. Well, when I started working for Ansel in the end of 74, in the fall of 74, he had just had a whole bunch of remodeling done in the house with a new working area and so on. And there were cameras and photographic stuff and books and prints and stuff out in the carport, out in what had been a garage, all kinds of, it was a mess. The first real task that fell to me was to try to put all of this stuff into some semblance of order. And one of the beauties was that in going through boxes and boxes and boxes of prints from, decades earlier and current and so on, it really struck me as to how many ordinary photographs Ansel had made in the course of his career. And it didn't bother him one whit, of making a photograph that didn't quite cut the mustard. He learned something from it. Don't do this again, kind of thing. And it was really a really remarkable perspective to have had a very modest opinion of himself. And, I make mistakes and blah, blah, blah. And he was always open to ideas about looking at processing film or doing something a little bit different. When I started working for him, he was calibrating his films, developing times for a zone 5 density, which we'd measure on a densitometer. And it occurred to me that, Ansel, wouldn't you rather know what's going on at the high end, for like a zone 8 or zone 9? He said, yeah, that's a really good idea. So we started testing films for a zone 8, the highest, in the textural range of the film is what we started calibrating to. So, I mean, he was very flexible about, doing things a little differently. And it was absolutely nothing about, you got to do it this way.
Yeah, I've always been a strong believer that mistakes it's just practice, right? Like, maybe it's planting a seed for an idea that you can improve upon later, or maybe, that's a nice concept, but the next time you're out making images, you'll build upon that concept and do a better job with it. So for me,
absolutely,
there's no wasted time in making mistakes.
No, none at all. And like I say, it didn't bother him one whit. He just learned from it. He had actually, he mentioned at one point having this sort of recurring, not quite a nightmare, but a very disturbing dream where he was going to be a solo performance at Carnegie Hall in New York. And there, the lights up on the names up on marquees and stuff. And he comes in, he sits down at the piano and he can't remember the first note. And it was like, and he kind of had that way. Another one of his favorite lines was, "Chance favors the prepared mind." And
I use that one all the time. It's a good one.
He wanted to be prepared when he saw something. And, his story about Moonrise Hernandez is a fabulous one. When I have a little interesting perspective on that, because the story is that he was in north of Santa Fe and driving down the road one day, and he all of a sudden comes around a corner and here's this cemetery and here's this moon and clouds and stuff. And he pops out of the car and can't find his light meter, and he calculates the exposure and all that. And that's partly true. But Ansel, first of all, knew the terrain fairly well. He'd photographed the cemetery in Hernandez a number of times in earlier years. And not only that, coming down from northern New Mexico, you come around a corner and you see the entire Sangre de Cristo Mountains. So 13 miles north of Hernandez, where the cemetery was, Moonrise was, he could see the moon and the clouds and the mountains. And, I spent enough time in the car driving around with him to know that for the next 20 minutes, he's driving down the road. There's got to be something I can do with this moon and clouds. There's got to be something I can do with the moon and clouds. And then he comes around the corner and there's the church and the cemetery, and he does screech to a halt. And, so maybe he couldn't find his light meter. I'll believe that, story, and he had a little formula for determining if you knew the brightness of something, you could calculate the exposure. And various assistants at workshops and I used to play a game by light meters used to read out in candles per square foot the brightness of something you're pointing it at. And that goes into a formula. And we'd say, okay, that rock is, 1,000 candles per square foot. What's the exposure? And you calculate and say, okay, we do that. So it works. It's a valid formula and on. And so I think Ansel may have done that, but it certainly wasn't the first time he'd photographed a moon.
Right. Right. The more chances you have at failure, the more opportunity you'll have to capture it when you actually get presented with the situation when it counts.
Indeed.
Do you have a favorite Ansel Adams story that you could tell us?
Which one? There's all kinds of stories about Ansel. I mean, it was just a joy to be around him all the time. Back in, I think, 1983, I think Playboy magazine did an article on Ansel. And in that course of that article, he said, I hate Reagan, President Ronald Reagan. And it was, there was an environmental thing. Reagan's Secretary of State, James Watt, was not one of Ansel's favorite environmental people. So as soon as that quote came out in the Playboy copy, the phone started ringing. Mr. Adams, this is the White House. The president would like to know why you hate him. And, and the president would like to meet with you. Well, no, I'm busy. No, I'm going to be out of town. No, whatever. And in 1979, I'd been married briefly, and my then wife and I decided to move to San Francisco, and I was going to open my own advertising studio because of my time earlier with Halberstat. And I still knew a lot of people in the advertising business and so on. But when I left, Ansel had asked me to continue making the special edition prints that I'd been printing for 4 years. This was 1979. So even though I had my photo studio up in San Francisco, I was still commuting down to Carmel about once a month on a weekend to hide out in Ansel's darkroom and make these special edition prints. And I was down there one weekend, and the phone rang, and it was the White House, and said, Mr. Adams, the president's going to be in Los Angeles tomorrow. You will meet with him. Okay. So Ansel drove himself to the Monterey County Airport and flew down to L.A. for the day. And they were supposed to meet for a few minutes, but they actually chatted for about an hour. I have a photograph of Ansel talking to Reagan with Reagan's big jar of Jelly Bellies sitting on the table. I was in the kitchen when Ansel came home that night. Now, Ansel walked in the door and said, the president's a very nice man. He'd make a wonderful neighbor. But they never did see eye to eye environmentally. So here you have Ansel Adams, who's this devoted environmentalist, sees, the president of the United States, whose comment once was, you've seen one redwood, you've seen them all. And Ansel comes in and says, he'd make a great neighbor. So, talk about a very flexible point of view on the world and people and things like that. That's for me is a wonderful story about Ansel Adams.
Yeah, I love that. We're going to start transitioning a little bit away from things about Ansel, but I do have one last question for you. How did his work influence your approach to making photographs?
Well, I think it affected me from the standpoint that I no longer worried about making a photograph that didn't quite cut it. That time when I started working with him, all of a sudden I didn't worry about having made a so-so photograph. I tried something, I learned something from it, and I moved on. It wasn't a bad photograph. It was just kind of, okay. So I think that was really one of the biggest things that happened to me. And as far as what it might have done to my own vision, I have to say that it really didn't change me very much. My photographs that I make right now are very varied, and they're not all that much different from what I did when I was just learning photography. I liked abstractions. I liked the nature and stuff. had a couple of, when I was studying with William Garnett at Berkeley, a couple of my favorite photographs. One was a little nature photograph I took of Strawberry Creek on the Berkeley campus with the water running and little sparkles of sunlight off of the water. Beautiful little natural thing. And another one I did in the design department was an abstract, black and white abstract of a coil of tubing on a wire hanging from the ceiling. It was just an abstract. Well, those were adjacent frames on the same roll of film. And, at one point when I was working for Ansel and getting into the gallery business and stuff, there was a period of time when my three most popular photographs was a Yosemite landscape, a still life of an onion, and a nude. The onion was done late at night in my house. I bought it to eat, but it sprouted out, and I decided to do something with it before I went to bed. The nude was during a friend's photography workshop. I was there with a whole bunch of other students, and so I still love the landscape, but I do a lot of architecture. I love, abstracts and other little things. So I'm open to anything. And in fact, Ansel was very broad. He never did a nude. Well, I can't say that. He did. I saw a Polaroid he did once of a girl in Yosemite with her shirt off. And Ansel said he was just testing skin tone. But her boyfriend wasn't very happy, I guess, according to Virginia. But, he had done something like that. But he said he could never figure out how to do a nude with his eyes, with his hands like this. And, so there's Ansel also. My work has continued to be very varied in its subject matter. I think the landscape has certainly been a bigger part of it since I worked with Ansel, but it wasn't that I didn't love landscape to begin with. Like I said, I started in forestry because I'm thinking of environmental studies and so on. Yeah, and I don't think it's really changed my work too much, other than that I think one of the biggest impacts that he had on my future photography life has been, I would say, maybe teaching. Ansel was very open to sharing his feelings about photography. And that's, his technical books were not trying to tell people how to do things. He was trying to help them do things maybe a little bit better or whatever. And as I mentioned, Ansel, kept himself listed in the phone book, and somebody could call up and say, Ansel, can I, Mr. Adams, can I come out and show you some photographs? He always, if he had time, he'd always say yes. Come on out, and he'd help with that. And then he had he and Edward Weston started the workshops together, I think in 1940 in Yosemite. So he was always involved with sharing his knowledge and being very open to it. And that stuck with me. I mean, that's one of the things that I do as much as anything else in my yearly workflow is doing workshops and doing a little online coaching and doing, all kinds of things. I still do 2 workshops a year for the Ansel Adams Gallery. Do one in the last couple of years. One in May has been for film and digital, open to anybody. And one in October is for film only. I figured, it's Ansel Adams. Let's talk about film. Yeah. Which is another point is Ansel would have loved digital technology. He loved science. They were doing digital scans of his prints for making books before he died. They weren't making digital photographs quite yet, but they were scanning prints, and he just thought that was wonderful. I don't think he'd be giving up film, but I'm quite sure that he would be very excited about the possibilities and what digital can do.
Yeah, for sure. So what would you say you're most proud of relating to your illustrious photography career?
Well, I think it's that teaching business. What I'm proud of is sharing my love for the medium and helping out people. I've got a friend in Idaho he's got a couple of 8x10 cameras, and he's taught himself, all kinds of things. He's just in his early 20s. and he loves it. And actually, he's been helping me out with some of the film workshops in Yosemite now and then. Just it's really rewarding to me to have this involvement with photography and to share my feelings about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's my real takeaway.
All right. Well, I really wanted to talk with you about what you call the language of photography. In what ways do our images have the ability to convey thoughts, feelings, and reactions for our viewers?
Well, language of photography it's a concept that I've embraced for decades, and and I've even talked about it and so on. Is that photography is a language. It can be anything from a set of instructions on a how-to book to it can be a documentary of war. It could be a documentary of building a bridge. It can be it can be haiku. It can be anything from practical, just this is the way it looks, to an expression of a feeling. And I think the expression of a feeling is how I respond to photography. I have absolutely no interest in photographing the quote reality of what's in front of my lens, which I think is one reason why I'm still so enamored with black and white photography. And this isn't to say I don't have great admiration for some fabulous color photographers, and I've made a lot of color work myself. But by its very nature, black and white is an abstraction of reality. Mm-hmm. There's, if I show you a color photograph with a green sky, or a portrait with purple skin or something like that, unless I'm doing something clearly kinky, you're going to say it's wrong. The colors, banana's not that color, or whatever. But in black and white, what's correct or not? I can use a filter and I can make a sky very dark. I can use a filter and make the same sky very light. And what's real or not? And so for me, photography is capturing how I feel about a subject rather than the literal rendition of what's in front of the lens. I mentioned one of my most popular photographs was a landscape, a Yosemite landscape. Well, that's a photograph that I made 3 days after Ansel hired me in July of '74. We had this storm come through Yosemite, and we had a field trip to the hike country. And on the way back down in the valley, we came out of the Crane Flat Tunnel, and bang, here's this scene with Bridal Veil Fall and these huge clouds and the Merced River down below. And I got my 4x5 camera out and photographed it. And as it happens, I was running the darkroom for that workshop. And so I was able to process my film within an hour or two of getting back down to Yosemite Village. So I knew I'd got it. I'd used the zone system. I couldn't have made a better zone system negative, but the reality of the light that actually existed in front of my lens, to me, was a total bore. It was my interpretation of the negative in making the print that, for me, gave the scene the life that I felt when I made the photograph. The reality was the sky was very, very bright, but I felt like it was really dark clouds and so on. And so the straight print of it is this, kind of hazy, misty fog or clouds in the valley, and then these clouds upside that are really bright. But my emotion about it was this dark, brooding sky and these glowing clouds hanging down in the trees. And so once again, another one of Ansel's favorite lines, being a musician, was the negative is the score and the print is the performance. And I think that's the key to me, is making a photograph be an expression of how I respond to something rather than a depiction of the reality of what's in front of the lens. And that's where so many people get the idea of the zone system kind of really off base, because they measure all the values, and they calculate to some great extent, how do they fit all of these tones, squish them into this that'll make a straight print on a grade 2 paper. Well, I have no interest in making a straight print. I want to darken it over here and lighten it over here and emphasize something. And so that's another way that, the zone system and all of that has kind of, people have missed the mark in what it's all about. It's getting the most useful information onto a piece of film, and then you can express your feelings about what those tones are. But if you underexpose a film, there's no shadow detail and there's nothing to print. So if you have the background to know how to expose and so on, then that gives you more feeling. So as this language, I'm kind of more along the line of the haiku people than I am about the instruction or the actual reality of what exists. Yeah, so that's a little feeling I've got.
Yeah, no, I mean, so you've done a great job of explaining the what of how photography can be a language. But I'd be curious if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the why. Like, why should we want to focus on communication in our work? And how is that different, if at all, from just showing the viewer what we experienced?
Well, I think that's a very personal thing, and that's another thing that I like to support in photography. Is photographers, they need to make it personal. Just like one of my very great friends is David Kennerly, who was President Ford's photographer, one of the first people to be at Jonestown after everybody drank the Kool-Aid back when. Photographer in Vietnam. I mean, he's had his neck on the line. He's been all over the place. And, he photographs reality, but it's also got some emotion to it that he works with. A lot of it, I think, is to expressing how his reaction to these scenes, as well as just plain click of the shutter. It's, capturing somebody's personality, photographing a politician and doing some other things that are just, so it's personal in terms of what is considered to be communication in that regard. And, as far as getting the word out about something or other, there are, a photojournalist or somebody like that is very into getting the word out about a cause or something they believe in or whatever. And that's a certain kind of communication that's very important. To me, it's a little bit, I'm not trying to tell the world how I feel about politics or a concept or anything like that, but I'm always looking. My wife, catches me a lot of times. We'll be having a conversation and I'll be moving my head around a little bit because I'm noticing how her head lines up with a window frame behind where we're talking. Or, I'll just look outside and I'll see a picket fence and I can't help myself but to look around and just see how, this lines up with that and doesn't line up with this, or this tone relates to another thing. So, I'm communicating those things in a different way. So it's a different kind of communication. But I think a lot of people are photographers because they don't feel capable of expressing their feelings about something in words or in painting or in music or whatever. I express the way I feel about something by sharing it as a photograph. There's this thing about old saying about you can't please everybody all the time, and nobody can please everybody all the time. It's, my work can really, really turn somebody on, and it'll really turn somebody else off. Oh God, why'd you bother doing that? This isn't important. This photograph of, what's going on over in the Middle East is important. I don't care about this, stupid mountain you're photographing. So, it's a matter of finding your own audience, and being faithful to your own vision and what you're wanting to express, why you're wanting to express it. And that's personal. And as far as technical photography and so on, I like to say it's like cooking. It's personal. How many ways are there to cook a potato, and none of them are wrong?
Right.
Well, I
right.
hate mashed potatoes. Oh, French fries? No, but let me have a baked potato. Or, it's personal. Somebody likes Pyro Developer and somebody else has never tried it, or I mean, you can spend $200 a pound on Amadol or something, but do you really need that? It's personal. There's nothing wrong with somebody wanting one developer and somebody wanting a different one. They're different, and
Yeah.
you decide what suits you.
Yeah,
So
I had a follow-up question relating to the how someone should convey these different ideas to our images, but I'm guessing part of your answer is going to be relating to something that I try to teach people, which is to know thyself in terms of, figuring out what are the things that really excite you, whether that be trees or mountains
yeah,
or pine cones, or maybe it's architecture, or maybe it's people on the street, whatever the thing is that you find really interesting and exciting to you,
yeah.
lean into that and then figure out how to imprint yourself into that interest or that thing that you're noticing that excites you. And then therein, I think, becomes the journey of self-expression and yeah. So I'm curious, would you add anything to that?
Well, I think that's exactly a wonderful thing, and we also, can learn things about ourselves as we go along. I mean, my lifetime's a big surprise to me in many ways. I mean, when I was a kid back in the 50s and early 60s, it wasn't uncommon for mothers or parents to, want to have their kids take an aptitude test. What's my kid going to be good at or whatever? And I remember my mother taking my dad died when I was 5, so it was just my mother and me. But um, she had me take this aptitude test one time, and they said I was going to be an artist. I thought that was the funniest thing I'd ever heard in my life. I was into technique and stuff. I started as a mechanical engineer. Engineering major. I liked math. I liked building things and making things. And yeah, I have the patent on an 8x10 enlarger adapter for Bessler, but because I needed to work an 8x10 in my own dark room, and I couldn't afford an 8x10, so I modified a 4x5 Bessler. Got a patent on it. But I'm doing that, but it was because I wanted to print 8x10.
Right.
So, I'm learning things about myself all the time, and I never know what's going to grab me next.
Along those same lines, there's something about this topic that I wanted to ask you about. How do we know when our photographs contain these communication devices? Like, is it based on the number of likes and comments we get on social media? Or, how do we know?
Well, social media certainly is a whole different deal now, and that's just kind of. I have to confess that I've had a hard time adjusting to Instagram, but I've got a lot of Facebook stuff going on and so on. But it's when you have response from somebody. But once again, like I said, nobody can please everybody all the time. And nobody can actually please anybody, everybody, anytime. And so it's a matter of this response you get from something that's important to you. If somebody who's very involved in certain things isn't interested in one of my photographs, well, it's probably because we don't share a lot of personal interests together. And, okay, it's okay if you don't like my photograph of Yosemite. But you do like this one I did of this factory, facade or something. So it's a matter of reactions from different people to know whether or not you've communicated what you're interested in. And it's at least with the technology that's available today. I mean, it's a lot easier to get your work out there. But then, well, I had a friend in St. Louis that said, if you buy a flute, you own a flute. If you buy a camera, you're a photographer. And now everybody with a smartphone has a pretty sophisticated camera with them all the time. So, it's the whole world of photography has changed quite a bit. And one of the things that's really great about teaching the film photography, particularly with people working large format, is with large format, you got to take your time. I mean, you have to want that photograph to take the time to set up the view camera or whatever. It doesn't mean you're going to make a great photograph. That's up to the photographer and what they do with it. But It's not like digital where, you no longer are stuck with the 36 exposure roll of film in your Nikon. You've got, a 128 gigabyte disc in your camera, and you can just hold the button down for an hour and a half and not run out of pictures. So it's a different world. But as far as, the communication aspect, you have to put yourself out there. Even in the old days, my first show was in a bookstore. And, I think I did sell a print for $10 or something. But, you have to get yourself out there, and then, working with various groups and so on. And once again, it's who you know and who gets the exposure, who gets your name out there, showing the work and being encouraged by people that really appreciate it. And sometimes to get that encouragement, you need to find out, you need to nurture the groups that relate to the kind of work you're doing. And
Well said. Yeah. One of the things I love about photography is that it can be this lifelong pursuit of self-discovery and slow improvement and leaning into different concepts or ideas that you want to explore through the camera. But I think for some people, they want that instant gratification, or they want like to immediately know like, oh, I'm a good photographer, or I'm making images that everyone likes. And I think, there's definitely a danger in that type of thinking. So my question is like, if someone is more into that like immediate hit, or being frustrated by the long journey, what would you suggest they try to do in order to stay engaged with photography long term?
I'd like to suggest slowing down. I did a workshop here in Santa Fe for Leica a number of years ago. And one of the things that we talked about, in the beginning, was to engage yourself with your subject. What is it that you want to say about this subject? Why did you pick the camera up in the first place? Ask yourself that, and then make it happen. And we went off on a field session, and one of the students came back, wow, I made 385 photographs this morning. No. You don't just hold the button down. Yeah, one of them might be really good, but how long are you going to spend going through 380 some photographs to find that one, for one thing? And did you actually take any time to connect with the subject you were working on? And so slow down is a really good thing, even if it's just to hone in, why are you taking this picture?
I was just going to say that why question has been really helpful for me. Why am I drawn to this subject? Why do I think it makes for an interesting photograph? Why do I want to press the shutter? And then, of course, what do you want to say with the work? I think is also something
Right.
a lot of people aren't asking.
I think that's exactly it, is the why. And for me, it's the why is not the what. For me, it doesn't matter if I'm dealing with a large landscape or whether I'm doing a still life of an onion. I don't care about making this onion look fabulous, that it's an onion. I think it's got a really neat shape and some really nice light about it and so on. It's not what it is, it's how it looks.
Mm-hmm. Or taking it a step further, what else is it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Edward Weston's Pepper Number 30.
Right.
He wasn't worried about, making this pepper look like the best pepper anybody's ever seen.
Right.
For him, it was a nude. It was it was shapes and form and tone and so on. And so it's not the what, it's it's the why. It's how does it look for me?
Yeah.
It's lights and angles and it's an image. It's not. I'm not thinking about subject. I'm thinking about how all the tones work together.
Right. Yeah.
I think that I never really thought of it that way, but yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, last question I have for you, Alan. Who you recommend for the podcast? Who are some photographers that we should get to know?
Well, there are several. One that I was just thinking of is Michael Kirchhoff, who is one of the partners of Analog Forever group. And Michael was my studio assistant in San Francisco the day our daughter was born, and had to take over printing a job we had just done in the studio while I was becoming a new dad. But he's gone on to really be very important in photography. He's a juror, with the Center Santa Fe groups that meet once a year. I think he'd be a wonderful person to contact. Another really great one that would be really, really great with a whole different view of the world would be Dan Burkholder, who teaches iPhone workshops and so on. But Dan's a perfect example of, I like to say that a good jazz musician knows how to play Bach. And actually, Ansel Adams has a granddaughter, Ginny Mayhew, who has a bebop sax band in New York, but she cut her teeth playing clarinet for the Bach Festival for years in Carmel. And every sound that comes out of that saxophone of hers is absolutely on purpose. And so, it's that kind of thing. Dan is similar to that. I mean, he has made gorgeous large format platinum prints and so on, but he's fallen in love with technology, and, he's doing, gold plate, gold leaf over platinum prints with colors, and he's just incredibly talented. So, I mean, he'd be really, really a great one. Those two names really pop up as people that are already in sort of a forefront of photography, but like to get their thoughts out some.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Alan. This has been tremendous. And for those who are thirsty for more, we're going to do a recording bonus episode for our Patreon supporters. And we're going to tell us some more stories about what all is involved in printing Ansel's Yosemite Special Edition negatives. But for now, thank you, Alan, so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Well, thank you to Alan for the wonderful chat on today's podcast. I hope listeners appreciated Alan's stories about Ansel Adams. If you enjoyed those historical nuggets, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Mary Street Hollander's biography on Ansel Adams. I've put a link in today's show notes for you. I also would love to hear from listeners about their thoughts on the episode. Each week, I prepare a list of questions for you to ponder after listening to the episode. These questions can be found within each episode's show notes over on Patreon, which you can join for free. Just head to patreon.com/fstop and listen to join in on the conversation. Cheers. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.